All right, it is 10:30 on the dot, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Some more people might trickle in as we go through our first slides here, and we'll just let them in and they'll jump right in with us. Thanks so much for being here today. I know that y'all have a million things going on in your schools all the time, so thank you for taking this hour and a half to be with us to think about how we are going to address unfinished learning of foundational reading skills in our schools and in our classrooms. I'm going to go ahead and drop the note catcher in case anybody needs it in the chat, and we will go ahead and get started. All of you have familiar names and faces at this point, but just a reminder, my name is Becca. I'm coming to you from Austin, Texas here today. I've been in elementary education for the last 12 years, and I'm excited to continue on this learning path with y'all as we really start to think about the plan we will put in place for kids that have unfinished learning needs and how we are going to address them by targeting the specific gaps that they have based on the assessments and the data that we collect. So as we get started today, let's start to think back to a goal you worked towards to accomplish and how you felt when you reached that goal. In the chat, we're just going to put in one word that captures how you felt when you met that goal. So go ahead and do that now. Awesome. Yeah, I see. We often feel proud, excited when we meet the goals that we set out to meet, maybe relieved or something like that also. So thanks so much for sharing out this quick reflection. I hope as we're thinking about the goals we set with kids in our classrooms, we can think about this in the same way, maybe the feelings that we have as their teachers when they meet their goals, or how they feel themselves as the students who have met whatever goal we've set out to accomplish together. Just a review of where we've been and where we're headed. We started out our first time defining our approach to addressing unfinished learning of foundational reading skills. Last time we dove in deep with Ms. Williams as we thought about how we assess and then diagnose unfinished learning of foundational reading skills. Today, we're going to keep going with Ms. Williams and think about how we actually respond to the data that we've now analyzed. Now that we know the gaps that our students have, what's the plan we're going to put in place and how are we going to carry out that plan? And then in our final session in about a month, we'll start thinking about this through the lens of our older readers that we know might still have some foundational reading gaps. Could somebody come off mute and read our objectives for us?
Sure, I can do that. Participants will recognize effective instructional practices driven by data, identify structures that support effective data-driven practices to address unfinished learning, and reflect on current assessment practices and develop an action plan.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kim. That's what we're going to accomplish today, and here is how. We're almost through our first 10 minutes of the getting started section. We'll then look at effective instruction driven by data by going deeper into Ms. Williams' data meeting and looking at the plans that she's created to address the gaps that her students have shown they have. We'll think some about the intentional structures that are in place at her school that allow for this type of data-driven instruction in her classroom and across her school. We'll then apply what we've learned to another scenario and think about how we might support a teacher who's struggling to be as data-driven as Ms. Williams. And then finally, we'll quickly wrap up and think about some next steps before our next session. Again, our Zoom norms today, these are the same as always. Thank you for being present, being here today. As much as you can, keep your camera on so we can see each other as we're talking to each other. If you need to turn your camera off for whatever reason, that's also absolutely fine. We're just appreciative that you are taking this time to be with us. As you're already doing, thank you for keeping your mic on mute when you're not talking. Please feel comfortable coming off mute. There's just 8 of us here in this session, so we can all feel comfortable sharing out at one time or another. We're going to have a couple of opportunities to engage with each other in breakout rooms today. So I will manage the time for us. You can head into those breakout rooms and I'll bring us back when we all need to be back together for the next thing. Use the chat to engage when prompted and also to ask questions if you have them. I'll work to field your questions as we're going. And if I miss something, as always, please bring it back to my attention. I dropped the note catcher in the chat at the beginning, but in case anybody needs it, dropping it again one more time. All of our materials for today are going to be in the note catcher, so we'll make sure that we all have access to it before we keep moving. And then again, this is a relatively short session in a relatively small group, so let's work to create and maintain our safe space for learning here. We know we're all here to get better as educators, to be able to serve our students a little bit more effectively. So let's bring that feeling into the space as we're participating and discussing with each other. And then this is a relatively short session, just an hour and a half. So if you have anything you need to take care of or any needs, please go ahead and take care of yourself and then come back as quickly as you can. So again, our note catcher, let's make sure we all have it open. You'll know that you have the correct one because it will look like what you see on the screen. It'll say session 3 at the top, and then the first thing, the first bit of content will be a case study review. So if you have the correct note catcher open, go ahead and give me a thumbs up so that I know we have the materials we need. Awesome. And then remember, this is yours. It made a copy, so this is in your drive. Put your name on it, organize it into whatever folder makes sense for you, highlight it as you need, because this is just your copy and nobody else has access to it. All righty. So we're going to start today by regrounding in best practice for effective data-driven instruction. As we begin digging into effective data-driven instruction, it's important for us to revisit this important tenet of assessment best practices. How we respond to data should always be done through the lens of determining the best way to bring students into grade level reading. Strong data practices do not use data to label students or to serve as gatekeepers that prevent students from accessing grade level instruction. So let's think back to some of the other assessment best practices we talked about last time. In the chat, go ahead and name one important fact you remember about assessment best practices. Perfect. Yes, thank you for calling out those 2 important points. We know that assessments should inform us about our own instruction. Do we need to adjust how we're instructing if most of our students aren't mastering the content that we're teaching them? It can point us in the direction of needing to scaffold instruction and give some one-on-one tutoring or small group tutoring to students who have gaps in the skills that we've just taught. Yes, we know that it needs to match the materials that we're teaching. So the assessment should be aligned to the core curriculum that we're implementing. So we know that we're assessing what we've actually taught. We should expect our students to have mastered that content. Absolutely. Take a minute to read through the slide. This should be mostly a refresher because it was from our last session, but go ahead and read through the different bullet points on this slide. And as you do, remember these practices are focused on foundational skills because that's what we'll mostly be discussing today. But when we're thinking about our students as skilled readers, it's important to remember that language comprehension and knowledge building are also important in their quest to become a skilled reader. So we're going to think about this last bullet point mostly today, how we use assessment to inform targeted acceleration. And we're going to get started doing that through Ms. Williams' case study now. So as a refresher, after careful analysis of the data collected through that Unit 2 assessment, alongside with what Ms. Williams already knew about her students through their performance throughout that unit of instruction, Ms. Williams was able to see some clear trends across the class for individual students. Ms. Williams concluded that she needed to revisit her instruction of nouns for the whole class because most of her students did not master that content, mostly because she reflected that she didn't do a great job teaching it. She needed to provide targeted instruction for Noah, Alejandro, and Crystal's unfinished learning of a few vowel patterns, very specific ones that she was able to pull out through data analysis. And then she needed to provide a more comprehensive intervention for Amanda's multiple areas of need, also by discussing the instructional practices both with the SPED teacher and herself and how they align and speak to each other. She decided she would also listen to the students who scored low on the comprehension portion of the assessment to make sure that the gap they were experiencing was in the decoding skills and not something else, because we know that decoding can greatly impact comprehension, but students may have a gap in comprehension for a variety of other reasons too. So now let's go to the next part of the data meeting. We're going to take a look at what Ms. Williams does to address her students' unfinished learning and the plans that she creates. We're going to independently read the case study about how Ms. Williams plans, and then we're going to discuss together what was effective about Ms. Williams' planning process, and we're going to try and be as specific as possible in citing the evidence that we found. We're going to take about 10 minutes to read this section of our guided notes. It's the first page all the way through the 7th page so that we can really see what happened in the data meeting, what they decided, and then also read the lesson plans that she pulled and the small group plan that she has in place to address the learning gaps. So take 10 minutes. I'm going to leave our prompt up on the slide. It's also in your guided notes for what we're looking for, and then we'll get into some breakout rooms to discuss with each other. All right. We are going to head into our first breakout room today. In your room, you're going to discuss what was effective about Miss Williams' planning process, and let's be as specific as possible when we note what was effective about her planning. The prompt is at the top of page 8 in your note catcher, in case you need a reminder of what we're supposed to be talking about. I'll be popping in and out of breakout rooms, so just to join your conversations, to listen and learn from y'all more, so no need to change your conversation or anything if you see me show up in your room. We will be in breakout rooms for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back to share out what we discussed together. So we'll see you in about 10 minutes back here. And remember, I'll bring you back together, so no need to come back early. All right, so let's debrief what we talked about in our breakout rooms, either through the chat or, because this is such a small group, we can just come off mute to share with each other what were the effective best practices that you discussed in your room with your colleagues.
We talked about reinforcing the subjects that she was low in data by putting the kids in centers, and then she also used her curriculum resources to do that. We thought those were all good ideas.
Yeah, using the core curriculum so we ensure that the instruction aligns with the gaps students showed and aren't hoping that what we see on the internet or anywhere else, even if it's cute and fun looking, is probably not the best choice. Using those core curriculum resources that we have are always going to be our best bet. What else?
In our group, this is Heather. Hi, guys. In our group, we were talking about how it was very explicit. It was very planned out. They had several opportunities to practice. Also, that's several opportunities for the teachers to check for understanding and see. The one question too that I personally had was exactly what would it be? How would they know that they were getting it and not? Like, what would the evidence be? What would the criteria be for them? And what would that look like? And so we were talking about that. I know also one of the people that I was talking to, my partner, that we were talking about was about how it was being planned together. So then that way there were multiple people being able to share and help out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe Miss Williams is one of the more effective teachers in her school. And if that's true, she can be a real resource for her colleagues. Or maybe she's brand new and there's somebody who's really showing her, okay, we gave an assessment, here's what we saw, here's what we do next, to really build her capacity to be able to use data to inform her instruction all of the time. And I think to Heather's point about, so what next? How do we know when these students have mastered this content? I think that is a definite point that needs to be on your data meeting agenda. How are we going to take our next set of data? Are we going to look at our anecdotal notes? Are we going to give a small formative assessment at the end of our lessons to see if they've mastered it? Do they have to show us a couple of times? I think that's a decision that you would need to make at your school to decide, do we keep going down this path, or do we need to, when we revisit this data, do we need to shift gears a little bit with this group of students? So we're going to look a little bit more closely at some of the effective best practices we saw. And here are some of the things, again, that I pulled out ahead of time. Much of what y'all already talked about in your groups and said in our main group. But we know that Ms. Williams was able to effectively plan instruction to address the unfinished learning because she was so deeply rooted in her data. I know Kim said that in her small group too. Every decision she made went back to the data she saw in lessons and in her assessment. And that's how she really was able to meet the needs of her students. So when we think of data in this scenario, it is the data from the assessments. It's also the progress monitoring throughout the unit. And she just did such a great job of using both things to inform her plan. So now we are going to take a look at how Ms. Williams uses her different types of instruction, whole group, small group, and individualized, to really meet the needs of her students. First, let's look at the whole group reinforcement. We know that the majority of her students were not proficient in the grammar skill. And since Ms. Williams recognized that her instruction was weak in that area, she decided to reinforce this with whole group instruction. She provided instruction that address the specific gap that students showed. They had a hard time identifying the type of noun she asked for. So she found a lesson in her high quality core curriculum that really got at that point where they had to match a noun to a specific category that she was calling out. Then she uses her data to create these small groups for students that have similar gaps. As she determined students' individual needs, she was able to group them with similar, in those similar groups with their specific areas of need. This allows for those flexible groups like we've been talking about these past couple of sessions, which we know are best practice because they're responsive to what students need, and they enable students to cycle in and out of them as needed. It's not a red, yellow, and green group that we keep kids in all semester, and the red group gets this type of instruction, the yellow group gets this type of instruction, the green group gets that type. This really gets at bringing kids into on-grade level learning by addressing their specific gaps. So let's take a moment to look a little bit more closely at her small group plan. We're going to go back to that portion in our guided notes or by looking at what you see on the screen to think about one structure you see in this lesson plan that aligns to a structured phonics lesson. Back in our first session together, we really went into the nitty-gritty of structured phonics. And so thinking all the way back to then, when you look at this plan, what's one piece of this plan that aligns to structured phonics? Let's type that out in the chat and then we'll debrief a bit more after that. Awesome. We know that a structured phonics lesson has explicit instruction. We know that we have to explicitly teach students sound spelling correspondences. And so we do that through explicit instruction. We know that they must have abundant opportunities for practice, both in and out of context. And she gives those opportunities to these students here too. And then also it's rooted in a high quality core curriculum. So I think sometimes when we think about small group instruction, we or our teachers think we need something separate and different, and that's not really the case here. We can use our high quality core curriculum to reinforce and reteach the gaps that our students are experiencing, and it doesn't have to be reinventing the wheel. We know that this will align to the gaps that they have and the gaps that they showed on their assessment if we're rooting in that high quality core curriculum. So let's think some more about the intentional structures that this teacher has at her school. We know that because she was able to really effectively analyze her data and make a plan, she was better able to address the needs her students have. So in our breakout room, we're now going to think back to the mindsets, systems, and structures in place at Miss Williams' school that allows for this type of thinking and planning. Before we get into our breakout rooms, we're going to take just 2 minutes to look back into our case study and find where we see evidence of these things in place. What mindsets do these teachers have at this school? What systems and structures have been set up so that these teachers have time and space to plan really effectively? Once we find the evidence in our text, we're going to go into to our breakout groups to discuss, and then we'll come back together to share out. So just 2 minutes to find evidence now. All right, so we're gonna head into our breakout rooms now. I didn't say this before, but if you get to your breakout room and you are feeling like you've discussed the mindset, systems, and structures in Miss Williams' school, and you have some extra time, feel free to bring this back to your own context in your own school. Start to think about, what are we doing really well at our school that we should leverage? What are some areas that are a little bit weaker, or that we need to strengthen in our mindset, systems, and structures to make our school a little bit more data driven and able to address unfinished learning a little bit more effectively? So if you get to your group and you have extra time, please feel free to discuss your own situation and your own scenario too. We're going to take about 10 minutes to discuss together before coming back together to share out. let's come back together and share out some of what we talked about in our different groups. We have a couple people come off mute, or we can put our thoughts in the chat also.
Well, we talked about several things. I could just summarize, I guess, but we talked about the systems that had to be in place for her to have the expectations that she had for the kids. So there must have been systemic expectation that they would have, all teachers would have high expectations for the kids. Also, the expectation was apparently that she needed to be assessment literate because of, and to use data, because that was the foundation of what she did. And we also talked about the fact that it was nice that the expectations that well, first of all, the system provided core curriculum for her, but also that the expectation was that she would use it. So, but we wondered if maybe there'd be maybe there was some autonomy that she had in choosing when to use it and when not. We didn't really know what the materials were, but I think those were the things we talked about. My group could tell me if I'm missing something.
See some head nods from your group. Does anybody in the other group want to share out some of, maybe piggyback off of what Kim said, or share some other points that y'all made? All right, let's keep going. I think Kim really summed it up pretty well for us. And this is how I was thinking about it too, just organized in a slightly different way, about how she was leveraging the time that was in place for her and the people that were in her building. So the grade level meetings and that supported the data analysis and that helped them develop their plan in response to the data that they took, really enabled her to address the unfinished learning needs of her students. They also had time in place for these small groups to happen that wasn't them being pulled out of core instruction, which would in turn make the gaps bigger later on. She had time to address their gaps in small group time or centers time, which was separate from that core curriculum or core instruction time. They also really strategically leveraged the people in the building. So a school leader or a content leader was there to help them develop their plans and analyze the data so that they could come up with the best plan possible and work together to ensure that they were meeting all of their students' needs. They also had the high quality teacher, Miss Williams herself, as the one who taught the small group instruction. I think sometimes we think small group and think this should be easier because it's less kids and maybe easier to manage, but we know we need the highest quality teachers intervening with students that have learning gaps to ensure that we're bringing them up and ensuring that they're mastering that content. And then finally, and I think this is what Kim got at in the beginning, was that growth mindset. They had a growth mindset around the kids. We're going to meet them all exactly where they're at, and we're going to bring them up into the on-grade level learning through these interventions. Angie had a growth mindset about herself. I didn't do a great job of instructing around grammar. It's not because I'm a bad teacher. I just missed it this time. We're going to try again, and everyone will get better. So that is just part of what's there at that school, and which enabled her to best meet the needs of her kids, or at least in her classroom, as we'll see in the next part of our session. So now we're going to use all of what we've learned about so far and apply it to another scenario. we're going to think about how a teacher might respond to data if it looked more like the table shown on the screen now. It's also in your note catcher in the next part. So you can see in the image that more of the students in the class, a larger group, did not meet proficient standards as in Miss Williams' class. For the purpose of what we're going to do, we're not going to go really in depth into the specific gaps that students had, but we're just going to think about how this teacher responded to this set of data in their class. So if we go back into the note catcher, we'll see the next part is about Miss Hill and how she responded to this set of data in her class. We're going to take about 5 minutes to read Miss Hill's section or case study. And as we're reading, we're going to think, based on what we've already learned in this session and in the last session, is Miss Hill's response to data best practice? Why or why not? And let's be as specific as possible when we find our evidence. And then how can mindsets about students and data impact student success? So we're going to read and reflect on those two questions. The reflection questions are also at the end of Miss Hill's case study. And then we'll go into our last breakout session of the day. We'll discuss our reflections and we'll start to brainstorm ways to help Miss Hill improve her data practices. So let's take 5 minutes to read now before we head into our last breakout group. All right, we've had a chance to look at Miss Hill and reflect on her data practices. We're going to head back into our breakout rooms one more time. We're going to talk about the reflections that we noted in our note catcher. And then as a group, let's work to brainstorm ways to support Miss Hill in adjusting her plan. Maybe you can think of a Miss Hill in your building right now that you can bring this all back to apply to your direct scenario, or maybe it's a little bit different, but I think we can use this time also to think about what are the strengths that we have in our building? How can we adjust them a bit to make them a bit more data driven with a bit more of a growth mindset if applicable? And we can talk about that with our colleagues in this breakout room too. So we're going to spend about 10 minutes one more time together, and then we'll come back together to share out before wrapping up. All right, we are all back together. I hope y'all had a robust conversation in the group I was in. We definitely did. I think it's not always super difficult to imagine this scenario happening. So let's share out a little bit. What do we think we could do to help Miss Hill adjust her plan going forward?
I feel like a mindset shift may be a good starting point. I was gonna say, I feel like you can't really dig into data if we don't kind of change the mindset that she has right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree that showing that growth mindset that it seems like her colleagues, some of her colleagues might have, could be a real benefit to her in getting into this work. In the session I was in before this, somebody was saying, you know, people get really defensive and are really afraid to admit that they don't know something or they don't know how to teach this specific skill. And so kind of like demystifying that for everybody.
It's kind of where I'm at right now. I feel like a lot of my teachers, if I do say, oh, the students need to get, well, haven't you seen that they are growing? I'm like, yeah, I know, I'm not saying that they're not growing, you know, I know. So I've kind of ran into that too. I'm like, they get a little defensive about, you know, what they are putting in. I said, you are doing great work. That is not what I feel like I sometimes have to like backtrack a little bit too, because I'm like, that was not the intention, is to tell you that you're not doing your job. So I could see a defensive being a good keyword there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, teachers work, as y'all know, like I think we've all been teachers. You work so hard. You put your soul into it. And then when kids don't do as well as you wanted them to, it can be pretty demoralizing. And it can sometimes be easier to, you know, blame the outside. And getting back to, you know, what is the reason that we're doing this? Why are we here? If we, you know, yes, there might be a reason outside. I think this year we had a huge reason that's on the outside why kids aren't growing as much. And at the end of the day, they still aren't reading where they need to be. So like, what can we do now? So maybe even just acknowledging that from the outset. You know, there's going to be 100 reasons why our kids maybe didn't get to where we wanted them to be. And maybe one of those reasons is that the instruction wasn't as great as we wanted it to be. But our kids still aren't where we want them to be. So what can we do now to get them there? I don't know. Yeah, it might just take some of that feeling of like, I'm being blamed. I'm already blaming myself and now it's being called out. Which is really hard. It's really hard.
Yeah.
Okay, I just saw the time. We have 5 minutes left, so I want to keep us moving. A couple more of the things that I pulled out ahead of time that y'all really spoke to in your groups. So again, yeah, pushing her to do much of the work that Ms. Williams is already doing. So identifying those specific skills and showing her how actually this is going to make your life and your job easier when we hone in on a couple of things rather than just saying like, I'm going to try and hit everything again. That probably won't happen because if we don't have a plan, it usually doesn't. And they don't need everything again. They need a couple of things. Continuing to show her, you know, we've already internalized this high quality curriculum. Let's use this, what we already know. We know it's aligned, we know it's good. And then how to progress monitor on an ongoing basis. Not an assessment every day, but how do I make a checklist to check off where my kids are? And make it really feasible and doable over a period of time. Maybe not all of this tomorrow, obviously. Awesome. So just quickly to wrap up here today, in the next month before our next session, if you're a school-based leader, which I think all of y'all are, we'll select one teacher or a group of teachers that you're already supporting in responding to their data. It can be either through whole group intervention, through a small group lesson, whatever the thing is that makes the most sense for you. And then next time we'll come together to really think about these older readers who are continuing to struggle and how we can address their gaps also. And then finally, before you head out of here today, I'm gonna drop the link for the survey in the chat.